In 1939, Nazi Germany began what they called a mercy program. It was anything but merciful. Action T4 targeted disabled children and adults across the Reich. Doctors received questionnaires asking them to identify patients with mental illness, physical disabilities, or chronic conditions. Those selected received transfer notices to special medical facilities. Families were told their loved ones would receive better care. They were being sent to die. The facilities looked like hospitals, but housed gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Patients were told they were being cleaned. Instead, they breathed carbon monoxide until they suffocated. Families received death certificates claiming heart failure or pneumonia. The real cause was always murder. Over 275,000 people were killed. Doctors tested lethal injections, starvation, and eventually Zyklon B gas. When public protests forced the program underground in 1941, the killing continued in secret. The same staff, the same methods, the same gas chambers were later used in Holocaust death camps. T4 wasn't just genocide. It was a rehearsal for something far worse.
This is actually insane. Did you know that for about 30 years, the German government sent kids in foster care to go live with PDF files because the government felt that PDF files would be the most loving caregivers a child could have? This right here is the man behind it all, Helmut Kentler. With the support of the Berlin Senate, the Kentler experiment put 13 to 15-year-old kids in the homes of single PDF file fathers. Kentler believed that PDF files could make acceptable foster parents and that any certain type of contact would be relatively harmless if not forced. Before we go any further, I should point out it's not exactly rare for a government to have experimented on kids in foster care or orphans or even adopted children throughout the course of history. There are the Indian boarding schools from the US and Canada, the Monster Study, the American government used foster kids as test subjects for HIV drugs, and the same thing happened in the United Kingdom, the Little Danes experiment in Denmark, Australia has its own recorded history of experimenting on these vulnerable kids. And even Ivan Pavlov, the Pavlov's dog guy, ran shady experiments on orphans. But I think it's safe to say Kentler's experiments were by far the worst of them all. His assertion that PDF file men were suitable caregivers because they would take more intensive care of the children led to decades of abuses of minors in Germany. Kentler called the cohabitation between quote-unquote problem children and PDF file men a win-win because in his eyes, the PDF files would look after the children with the utmost dedication, quote, because they are in love with them, smitten, and infatuated. The Berlin Senate Department for Youth and Family funded this experiment and created several foster homes with PDF file fathers. Somehow, Kentler was not alone in his views. In fact, many people apparently shared his views. A network of researchers, artists, educators, and priests formed who believed that this type of inappropriate contact with children was not abuse, but rather care. A well-known writer wrote an essay titled The Under 16s in which he celebrated physical love with minors. We don't know what Kentler's true motivations were or whether or not he was one of the creeps involved in all of this, although this specific detail makes it very difficult to believe he wasn't at least somewhat motivated by his own opportunity to participate. Kentler himself adopted 3 children and fostered at least one more, and if you believe his colleague, Kentler confided in his friend that he was abusing at least one of these children for years until that person ultimately took his own life. But don't worry everyone, because after about 30 years of experimenting on kids in foster care, Kentler finally changed his mind on PDF files having inappropriate contact with children and described it as a disorder. If only it took you, I don't know, less than 30 years to figure that out, man.
The first victims of the Holocaust were German people with disabilities, and their status as disabled people was the reason why the regime thought they should be exterminated. T4, the program under which these earlier atrocities were committed, served as a testing ground and a pilot program for the methods of mass extermination and mass body disposal that were used throughout the Holocaust. Disposable Humanity is a documentary about this. It is a very well-made film and I highly recommend it, especially if you were somebody who did not know about T4 before watching this video. If you don't even know how the worst parts of history started, you won't be able to notice them repeating until it's too late.
A disabled child murdered in the Holocaust. Louise Schultz. Schultz was born in Hamburg in September 1938 to her mother, Frieda. Sadly, through birth, she had contracted gonorrhea from her mother, and Louise was then be taken into the care of the Aldersdorf Asylum as her mother could not look after her. It was spotted that her development wasn't as fast as the other children. She struggled to talk and walk. In 1943, the British would bomb Hamburg and the asylum would be shut. All the children in the asylum were moved to different facilities throughout Germany. However, under the Nazi T4 program, designed to eradicate all disabled who were mentally and physically incapable. On the 4th of September 1943, she was executed by an injection to the heart, one of 400,000 disabled people murdered in the Holocaust.
This is what it looked like the last time disabled people were locked away. Willowbrook opened in 1948 and it was called a school, but it was really one of the most horrific institutions for disabled people in American history. Doctors were performing cruel medical experiments on these patients, intentionally infecting them with hepatitis. Children and adults with disabilities were living in their own filth. At one time, there was over 6,000 people crammed into a facility that was only meant to house 4,000 people. One employee called the institute a human warehouse. Then cameras got in, and the footage shocked the country. Willowbrook State School soon became a turning point for the disability rights movement, but it also pushed America towards community-based living for people with disabilities. Today, in 2026, the Department of Justice is now questioning the laws that we have set in place because of Willowbrook to make sure that people with disabilities can live and be fully integrated in their communities. When these laws are weakened, it puts people with disabilities in a very vulnerable place where things like state-run institutions become the only options for some people. And we all know what that looks like.
Did you guys know that in 1939, Germany started a program that targeted and murdered thousands of disabled people? Yes, so if you thought it was just the Jewish people they were targeting, no, this was before they started targeting the Jewish. They started targeting the disabled first, and then as a final solution, they were like, all right, well, let's start targeting the Jewish now. Like, they were trying so hard to have pretty much the superior race and wanted to get rid of anybody that was defective in the race, even though being disabled is not being defective at all. I feel like at the end of the day, we're all human. We can't control what we were born with or what we end up obtaining throughout our years of living. You know what's even crazier? They had no remorse for kids. Just like how this country and the world itself has no remorse for children now. Yeah, they really didn't care. The program originally was for babies and toddlers, but then they were like, hey, you know what? Let's have it all the way up to the ages of 17. 17 years old. Literally sitting here persuading parents to have their children taken into these clinics to be treated and checked out. And yeah, they were checked out all right. Like, to the point that it was over 10,000 children that disappeared during this time. So yeah, that's really insane. But I know you're probably sitting here like, why is she bringing this up now? One, because people are probably not aware of history, and I'm learning just like how you guys are learning. And two, because history might be trying to repeat itself. RFK Jr. literally sat on national TV and was saying how he wants to get data of everybody in the United States that has autism and ADHD. Like, invade people's privacy completely. Kind of like how Elon got all our information and whatnot when he really didn't need to have all that information. So yes, my charts, data, assessments, all that. If you've gotten it done, then y'all will be on the list, more than likely. And I'm hoping they don't try to recreate this whole 1930s German idea, because That's insane, but hey, that's the truth behind all these asylums and centers for the disabled. I never trusted them. Never.
Hitler's regime killed disabled Germans first. Under Action T4, the Nazi regime systematically targeted disabled Germans. Between 1939 and 1941, an estimated 200,000 to 250,000 people with physical and mental disabilities were murdered. They were taken from hospitals and institutions and killed in gas chambers disguised as showers. This program became a blueprint, both in method and mindset, for what would later be used in the Holocaust. Because before an entire people were targeted, the Nazis first tested their ideology on the most vulnerable.
Willowbrook finally closed in 1987, 15 years after Geraldo's exposé, 26 years after the hepatitis experiments began. A class action lawsuit forced New York to shut it down and move residents into community homes. But here's what nobody talks about. Many Willowbrook survivors are still alive, now in their 60s and 70s, living in group homes across New York. And some say the conditions aren't much better. Clinic of Control, unpacking the history they don't teach in medical school. After Geraldo's 1972 footage aired, parents of Willowbrook residents filed a federal lawsuit, Willowbrook Consent Decree, demanding reform. The court ordered New York to reduce overcrowding, improve conditions, and transition residents to smaller community-based facilities. It took years. Willowbrook's population slowly decreased as residents were moved to group homes. But the transition was chaotic. Many former residents were placed in facilities with minimal oversight. Staff were undertrained. Funding was inadequate. And the abuse didn't stop. It just became less visible. In 2011, a New York Times investigation found that former Willowbrook residents living in state-run group homes were still being neglected, injured, and dying at alarming rates. One man, a Willowbrook survivor, choked to death in a group home because staff weren't properly trained. Another was found with untreated bed sores. The state paid settlements to families, but rarely fired staff or shut down facilities. Bernard Carabello, one of the most famous Willowbrook survivors, was featured in Geraldo's original footage. He was trapped at Willowbrook for 18 years, misdiagnosed as intellectually disabled when he actually had cerebral palsy and could communicate. After Willowbrook closed, Bernard became a disability rights advocate. He testified before Congress, appeared in documentaries, and fought for better treatment of people with disabilities. But he also said this: closing institutions didn't solve the problem. It just moved people to smaller institutions with less oversight. Dr. Saul Krugman, who ran the hepatitis experiments, never faced criminal charges. He retired from NYU, received awards for his research, and died in 1995. The children he experimented on, those who survived, received no compensation, no apology, no acknowledgement of what was done to them. So Willowbrook closed, but the systems that allowed it, warehousing disabled people, experimenting on vulnerable populations, prioritizing cost over care, didn't disappear. They just got quieter. Drop your take below and follow for the next case file.
Before the Holocaust reached its full scale, the Nazis had already begun murdering disabled and mentally ill people inside Germany itself. This program was called Aktion T4. Under the disguise of euthanasia, tens of thousands of patients were systematically murdered in psychiatric hospitals using gas chambers, starvation, overdoses, and lethal injections. One of the doctors involved was the German neurologist Julius Hallervorden. In autumn 1940, he was reportedly present during the gassing of children. Afterwards, he removed their brains directly at the killing site for his own research. Over time, he dissected the brains of at least 700 victims of the Nazi euthanasia program. After the war, Hallervorden openly described the murdered victims as wonderful material, saying the brains included idiots, malformations, and early childhood diseases. And yet, despite all of this, he continued his career in post-war Germany. He later conducted research in Gießen, the same city where I studied myself. He worked at the Max Planck Institute, received the Federal Cross of Merit in 1956, and was awarded an honorary doctorate in 1962. Only decades later was this honor finally revoked after renewed investigations into his involvement in Nazi crimes. The case became another disturbing reminder of how many perpetrators of Nazi atrocities were able to continue prestigious careers after 1945.
The first victim of the Nazi euthanasia scheme, Gerhard Kretschmer. He was born on the 20th of February 1939 to Richard and Lena. He was born blind with one arm and one leg. He was also subject to convulsions. His father believed his son was a monster and took the newborn to Dr. Werner Keitel, a paediatrician at a children's clinic in Leipzig, and asked for his son to be put to sleep. Keitel told him this is illegal and then he would have to be put into a care home. However, within months, the Nazi T4 project would start, and on the 25th of July 1939, he was euthanized using an injection to the heart. He's only referred to as Child K on his records. However, he's one of 400,000 who would die as part of Action T4, a scheme to destroy the mentally and physically disabled.
I remember Mum and Dad telling me that I was going to go to the hospital for people that are retarded. I said, Mum, I'm not retarded. I wanted to go to the special education unit at Warden Woods Public School, but Dad didn't want me put there. They were embarrassed to have a retarded child. I thought that my siblings and my parents would live with me because they never told me that they weren't going to admissions. Mom let go of my hand and the nurse with a cap took me in. And I said, Mom, aren't you coming? Aren't you coming to live with me? And she said no, and she couldn't look at me and I couldn't understand why. I was 7 years old at the time. I was so afraid.
Acknowledge us. Acknowledge that Americans need health care and disabled lives matter. We want it right. We want it right.
Today in Boston, we're celebrating 35 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act and raising the ADA flag on City Hall Plaza. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a landmark federal civil rights law that protects people with disabilities. After years of advocacy and activism, the ADA finally passed in 1990. And this week, we're celebrating critical protections for the right to work, access public services, connect with community, and much, much more. These civil rights protections are hard-won. And this year, when we celebrate 250 years since our city kicked off the American Revolution, we also recognize the generations of leaders who have continued to shape and refine what it means to be free. Our city's Disabilities Commission is proud to work in partnership with our diverse, strong, creative community of disabled residents and with the disability groups across the region. We're excited to continue working together to make Boston a home for everyone every single day.
You want to take I'll take all night if I have to. All right.
Yeah, Jennifer. What did you say, Jennifer?
I'll take all night if I have to.
Oh, we'll be here all night. Oh, we're going to be here. Don't worry. We'll be here as long as it takes. As long as it takes.
What do we want? ADA!
new memo is one of several attempts to change services and policies dedicated to people with disabilities. The DOJ says states aren't required to provide home and community-based services that have long kept disabled Americans out of institutions if they would benefit from these other services. And as the administration seeks to shutter the Department of Education, it's moving key responsibilities to agencies which disability advocates say are less equipped to handle them. For perspective on what these actions mean for the disability community, I'm joined by Maria Town. She's president and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. Maria, you are on the move today. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I first want to ask about this DOJ memo, which really provides a new interpretation of these existing laws and a Supreme Court decision that reaffirmed what we have understood to this point to be the rights afforded to people with disabilities. Can you just walk us through what those existing statutes are?
So in the Americans with Disabilities Act, which turns 36 next month, there is an integration mandate. And the Olmstead decision is a Supreme Court decision that turns 27 years old today that affirmed the integration mandate in the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Olmstead decision stated that people with disabilities had to be served in the most integrated setting whenever possible. What this means in practice is that states cannot forcibly institutionalize people with disabilities, whether that be in nursing homes, state psychiatric facilities, or in other institutional settings. And so this memo from the Department of Justice, which says that Olmstead is not enforceable, completely goes against all previous legal precedent. And it also goes against the will of Congress and the will of the Supreme Court.
So if states no longer feel obligated because of this DOJ legal opinion, which we should mention is not a law, but could have far-reaching implications anyway, if states don't feel obligated to provide these services to people who would benefit from them rather than go into an institution, what does that mean for the people who rely on home and community-based services?
This means that people's ability to live in their homes and in their communities and with their families and friends that they love is in jeopardy. If states decide not to follow decades of legal precedent and existing civil rights, it means that people with disabilities may be forced into institutions instead of being provided with services that allow them to thrive in their communities. It may also mean that people's health suffers, and in the worst case scenario, it means people will die. We know that people with disabilities and older adults have better outcomes and live longer lives when they are served in the community and not in institutions. So this could have extremely dire consequences for many people and their families across the country.
Separately, Maria, the administration is taking steps to move oversight of special education from the Department of Education to HHS. Here is what Education Secretary Linda McMahon said recently about these changes. Quote, "By closely partnering with HHS, we will align federal services to improve academic outcomes, strengthen access to programs and information, and support people with disabilities so they can gain self-sufficiency, life tools, and meaningful employment that they need to succeed in their lives." How does your group see it?
This move basically re-medicalizes the education of students with disabilities. Putting special education in education asserts that students with disabilities have a chance at mainstream curriculum, at developing critical thinking skills, and in participating in the mainstream classrooms with their non-disabled peers. We see this as a resegregation of students with disabilities when literally for the past 50 years, the standard has been to serve students with disabilities in the least restrictive environment and to ensure that students with disabilities have a free and appropriate public education. We are concerned that the public education students with disabilities will receive will no longer be appropriate because it will no longer be a meaningful education.
And we see the government focusing on changes to policies and services that affect children and adults with disabilities. What are the stakes for the wider disability community here?
These changes, both the change in education coupled with the DOJ memo, basically put our nation back at least 50 years, if not more. We are worried that we will see the progress that's been made on disability rights and on the quality of life of disabled people, whether they're young or old, erode very, very quickly, and that hard-fought progress will be lost.
Maria Town, President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Support journalism you trust. Support PBS News. Donate now, or even better, start a monthly contribution today.
Breaking news for the disability community. I've been talking about how there is a coordinated attack against disability rights, and now the 6 states that are challenging Section 504 in the lawsuit Texas v. Kennedy are showing us exactly what that means. If you don't know me, I'm Allison. I'm a legally blind disability rights lawyer, and I lost my job last year during DOGE cuts to disability funding, and I used this platform to help people understand what's happening to our rights. For 27 years, the Department of Justice was the federal agency that helped us, people with disabilities, enforce our right to live in the community that was established under the Supreme Court case in Olmstead in 1999. When states tried to warehouse people with disabilities, the DOJ stepped in, investigated, and used the ruling in Olmstead to force states to expand home and community-based services for people with disabilities. So this new DOJ memo, it doesn't erase Olmstead, but it does something just as dangerous. It tells the whole federal government that they don't need to treat the right to live in the community for people with disabilities as a civil right, and it does not need to be enforced. So in plain language, the federal agency that had our back for the past 27 years has literally just changed sides. Here's a quick overview of the memo. So in June, DOJ's Office of Legal Counsel issued a 39-page memo saying that neither Section 504 nor the ADA actually require states to provide community-based services, and that Olmstead, the Supreme Court's decision in 1999, does not actually establish a broad integration mandate. So now this out-of-step memo is the federal government's official position. Let's break down how this coordinated attack is playing out, because now we know that the federal government is not going to enforce the right to live in the community. So what's happening with Texas v. Kennedy, the lawsuit challenging Section 504's community integration mandate? In plain language, the DOJ memo is now being used by the 6 states in Texas v. Kennedy to support their argument that Section 504's community integration mandate goes too far. The states were already going after community integration, and this DOJ memo gives them fresh legal cover to say community living is optional and not a civil right. This is what I mean when I say disability rights are under a coordinated attack. The DOJ memo, Texas v. Kennedy, all of this comes together to challenge the right of us people with disabilities to live in the community instead of institutions. Please be sure to share this so more people in the disability community know what's going on, and follow me for more breakdowns and information about what's going on related to everything disability rights, as well as what you can do to make sure we don't go backwards. Peace.
This speech was very much inspired from a conversation that I had with 2 people from SPT. I am sick and tired of my disabled body being deemed as a fire risk for simply navigating a world which close-minded, able bodies created for themselves. They carved out their rule books to have staircases, with the naivety that people like me would never climb them. But here I am, and here we are. We are not going anywhere. We will persist. We demand change, and we demand it now. If the only people who aren't a fire risk have to tick boxes that all their limbs work, does that mean that those who don't pass the able-bodied fire escape checklist should be excluded or left to burn? At what point does this become hidden eugenics? And at what point will there be a wake-up call? A wake-up call that disabled people have always and will always exist, whether you like it or not, and that we deserve to get from A to B safely like anyone else. Change has to happen. The rule books and legislations must be rewritten before that wake-up call is fatal. To any able-bodied person listening to this right now who are thinking to themselves, this isn't my problem, I am telling you now that your able body is not permanent. I was able-bodied. Now I bum shuffle the Glasgow subway with my wheelchair to get about. You are no better than a crip because you were dealt different cards, and your hand can change at any time. You are not immune to inaccessibility. You are not immune to disability. And you are not immune to the fragility of the human body. It is within your best interest that you fight for a better now for us, and it will make a better future for you too. Start fighting now while it's a choice. There will become a point in your life where there is no other option but to care. What do we want? Access! When do we